Today, we're tackling a timeline that is as complex as it is absolutely fascinating: the American road to emancipation. We're going to take a really focused look at the history of Juneteenth, exploring how one single announcement down in Texas fits into a centuries-long narrative of slavery and freedom. By digging into the hard historical data and primary sources, we're going to unpack this incredible journey, and then we'll see how that legacy is so powerfully celebrated today.
If you asked most folks when slavery ended, they'd probably point right to the middle of the Civil War, right? But the historical record shows us that emancipation wasn't just some switch that got flipped overnight. Not at all. It was this highly fragmented, deeply contested legal process. So to truly understand the end of slavery, we have to start by looking at the day that literally symbolizes the arrival of freedom.
Which brings us to Section 1, the first Juneteenth.
We begin our journey on a very specific, monumental date, June 19, 1865. Now, fun fact, Florida actually had its own Emancipation Day a bit earlier, on May 20th when the proclamation was read in Tallahassee. But it was this June date that really got cemented in our national history. Why? Well, because on this day, Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and Texas was the absolute last state to receive this order in 1865. Granger arriving there basically marked the moment the final Confederate state was forced to acknowledge the executive order of freedom. This is the literal text that informed the enslaved people in Texas of their freedom. And if you look closely, notice how it specifically points back to, quote, a proclamation from the executive of the United States, right? It wasn't creating some brand new law on the spot. It was enforcing an executive order that already existed. And that brings up a pretty massive timeline issue.
Let's dig into that in Section 2, Proclamation versus Reality.
So, this dramatic delay highlights a really major historical misconception about the actual, on-the-ground legal power of Abraham Lincoln's famous order. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, on January 1, 1863. And sure, this executive order is entirely legendary today, but at the time, its true legal reach was heavily restricted. The historical texts actually tell us that Lincoln issued this primarily as a military tactic. He was hoping it would encourage uprisings and cause chaos throughout the Confederacy to help the Union win the war.
And this breakdown brilliantly illustrates the political reality of that document. The order only declared freedom for enslaved people in the Confederate states that were actively in rebellion against the Union. Meanwhile, in the loyal Union and border states, the proclamation did absolutely nothing. Slavery continued to be completely federally legal in the North and in those border Union states.
Border states were slave states that did not secede from the Union. We're talking specifically about Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. Lincoln strategically exempted these states from the proclamation. Why? Because he desperately needed to keep their political and military support to hold the Union together. If he outlawed slavery there, he risked them jumping ship and joining the Confederacy. So the hard truth is, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free enslaved people in these loyal territories.
All right, let's move on to Section 3, the true end of slavery.
Since the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually abolish slavery everywhere, we have to look at what finally brought about the definitive legal end of slavery in the U.S. And the sheer span of this legal struggle is astounding. Just look at this timeline. We start way back at 1655 with the first legal ruling of lifelong slavery. Then we move through the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, hit the actual legal end in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, and then, incredibly, we see a final ratification in Delaware that didn't happen until way into the 20th century in 1901. Let's look a bit closer at where this all started.
Because the history here is incredibly complex. Back in 1655, there was this landmark court case involving two African men. So Anthony Johnson was a man who had been kidnapped from Angola by Portuguese slavers, sold as an indentured servant in Virginia, and eventually he actually earned his freedom. He became a wealthy planter, bought an 800-acre tobacco plantation, and even acquired his own indentured servants, including a man named John Cassor. Well, when Cassor claimed his indenture contract had expired, Johnson literally took him to court. From 1653 to 1655, this legal battle waged on until the court ultimately granted Johnson ownership of Cassor for life. According to the historical record, this was the very first official court ruling that a person could be held in slavery for life, which severely encouraged the expansion of slavery throughout the colonies.
Now, fast forward exactly 200 years from that initial 1655 ruling. The Civil War has ended, and the 13th Amendment is ratified on December 6, 1865. This is the real game changer. This is the document that actually provided the nationwide legal end to slavery that the Emancipation Proclamation just didn't. It finally abolished slavery and involuntary servitude across the entire United States, with that one infamous constitutional exception, of course, being as a punishment for a crime.
But remember those border states we were talking about earlier? Astonishingly, because Delaware was completely exempt from Lincoln's initial proclamation, slavery continued legally there right up until that 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. However, Delaware officially refused to ratify that amendment at the time. In fact, they held out for decades. Delaware did not formally ratify the 13th Amendment until February 1901. That's over 35 years after the Civil War had already ended. Just let that sink in.
Which brings us to Section 4, Modern Celebrations in Groveland.
Communities like Groveland and other areas around Lake County are honoring this profound heritage with absolutely incredible energy. Over at Lake David Park, the annual Groveland Juneteenth celebration literally brings history to life. The whole community gathers for live music, step dancing, local art displays, and some incredible food from local food trucks. It's got this amazing block party atmosphere, with performances that directly honor freedom and heritage. It really proves that the best way to honor the struggles of the past is to thrive brilliantly in the present.
But as we're celebrating this vital American milestone, we can't ignore the global reality of the present. And the data reminds us of a really sobering fact. 46 million. Today, across 167 countries worldwide, an estimated 46 million people are still actively affected by slavery. We're talking forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and human trafficking. The institution of slavery, in all its various modern forms, unfortunately, did not end in the 19th century.
Which leaves us with this final thought for today. How do we take these profound lessons of delayed freedom and ultimate triumph from Juneteenth and apply them to the ongoing struggle for human rights worldwide? As you reflect on that 200-year legal struggle in America, that agonizing 2.5-year delay in Texas, and the incredibly joyous celebrations happening in places like Groveland today, I really want you to consider how that enduring spirit can fuel the modern fight for the 46 million people out there still waiting for their own Juneteenth. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I can't wait to explore our next topic with you very soon.